Jesus taught crowds of people that the right response to God's kingdom rule and authority was believing and repenting, or you might say by trusting Him and deciding to live life according to God's ways rather than their own. And on one occasion, after spending a day teaching about this, he and his disciples got into a boat and went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And this is where Mark chapter 4 picks up the story. This is what it says. Verse 36, and leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great fear, and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? As they're crossing the Sea of Galilee, suddenly a storm overtakes them. And it's so violent, the verse 37 says that their boat begins to fill with water. And the next verse gives us almost a comical account, a contrast. We see Jesus in the stern, asleep on a cushion or a beanbag chair of some sorts. And while the storm is raging around, his disciples are fearing for their lives, he's asleep. And in their worry and their terror, they wake up Jesus and ask him a question that probably every one of us asks him at one point or another in our lives. Jesus, don't you care? Have you ever asked him that question? Jesus, don't you care? Jesus, don't you care that we're losing our business? Don't you care that we can't have kids? Don't you care that I've lost someone I love? Jesus, don't you care that I'm so lonely? Don't you care that I'm depressed? Jesus, don't you care that I feel like I'm losing it? Jesus, don't you care? You see, following Jesus isn't merely about right doctrine and right morality. These are important, and I don't want to downplay that. But there's more to it than that. It's in those moments and those seasons of life where we wonder if Jesus even cares that we learn to walk by faith and not by sight. It's in times of suffering and times of worry that our theology affects our experience, and our experience affects our theology. You see, a lot of people reject Jesus because they can't conceive of him allowing suffering to enter into their lives. The reasoning goes like this: if Jesus loves me, then bad things won't happen to me. And since something bad has happened, either Jesus isn't real, he doesn't care, or he's mad at me. And so in seasons of loss and trial and suffering, people often turn away from him. But suffering messes with our reasoning. Bad things happen to everyone eventually. Even billionaires die. And if you reject God because of suffering, then you're only left with the material universe. You're left with nature. And nature doesn't love you. Nature certainly doesn't care about you either. Suffering will still come into your life. But will that cause you to reject nature? Probably not. Most people don't reject nature. They don't reject atheism because of suffering. The reason people reject God in their suffering is because they blame him. He could have done something and chose not to. Maybe you blame him too. Someone you lost or something bad happened in your life and you blame God for it. Well, today I want to invite you to open your heart and your life again to Jesus Christ, to trust him instead of blaming him. In this passage in Mark chapter 4, we don't see Jesus making a reasoned, logical argument when suffering comes, when his disciples are afraid for their lives. He simply stands up in the boat. He speaks to the storm in the way that you or I might speak to a belligerent child, and he says, "Quiet, sit down." And the thing that bothers us most about this question, Jesus, don't you care, is that he doesn't really seem to answer it when we ask him. But look at verse 40. His disciples say, Jesus, don't you care that we're dying? And he doesn't answer their question either. He simply asks them, and I would say he asks us, why are you so afraid? Have you no faith? The one who's strong enough to rebuke the storm is strong enough to accomplish his purposes. The one who created all things out of nothing by speaking is strong enough to bring all things together according to his purposes. He's strong enough to not waste our suffering. After all, he didn't waste his own suffering. The one who would step out of the glories of heaven, take on humility in human flesh, suffer betrayal and humiliation and death on the cross in order to accomplish his purposes, demonstrates and proves that he's good and he's loving and he will accomplish those purposes. So when you and I cry out because of stuff going on in our lives, because of loss, because of suffering, because of some great trial we're enduring, when we cry out, Jesus, don't you care? The answer is, of course he does. We've just got to trust him. There's no clearer demonstration than the cross of Christ that he cares. No clearer demonstration than his resurrection, that he will accomplish his good and loving purposes. It's okay. It's okay to ask him, Jesus, don't you care? Just remember, the answer is, of course he does. And we've got to teach our hearts to believe that. We've got to walk by faith. That trust, that faith, points us to our hope that we have in him and with him. And so if you decide to reject Jesus because of some deep wound or some great loss in your life, where will you find hope? Where will you find the strength to trust that things will all work out? Jesus walked it. He promises it, so that when we trust him, we can persevere and we can endure through seasons of trials. Will you come to Christ and trust him enough to learn to live according to his ways? Will you stop blaming him and instead decide to trust him? Will you entrust these present sufferings, these present trials that you are enduring? Will you trust these to him as well? After all, he cares for us more than we know. His death on a cross proves that. It reconciles us to him, and his resurrection gives us hope. So trust in him. God bless you all. I hope to see you soon.